Hello, back in time, BassMaster magazine. We're up to January of 1981, and kind of like the color just dude, I did a lot of that kind of fishing when I was growing up, fishing in an inner tube or just wading with no inner tube. And the fish a lot of times were between your legs, just like it's showing there. But
why the inner tube? Just for flotation?
Well, yeah, because the deep water, you could go across deep
Okay.
pools in the creek, and you
Okay.
could go across. You know, if you're in a pond, you could go out in the pond, and it was just.
How you cast and.
Oh, you're sitting in this. You're sitting in this.
Oh,
They have a built-in. Most of them, you built in a seat,
Okay.
or they finally could buy them with a built-in seat, and they were pretty comfortable. Put on a pair. You'd put on a pair of scuba, flippers, and you could get around pretty good. And again, here we go. There's still these little short handle rods, so I don't see anything new there. Usually 6.5 foot. Now there are a lot of them were not speed sticks. A lot of the early ones were speeds, what called fiberglass speed sticks. These are now pretty much all the high-tech materials, this whole issue is about fishing from the bank. Bass, was knowing that still a lot of people didn't have fancy bass boats, especially back then, and a lot of their fishing was to small ponds and small creeks around their neighborhood or in their area, and so this pretty much what this whole issue is about. But here's kind of a neat article. It's basically zany tactics for catching bass. Okay, we learned as anglers fairly quick on, especially when you were at the competitive level, that a lot of people, you come to a nice looking submerged bush out there, and a lot of people, you started analyzing where would people throw their lure. And they would normally throw it out on the edges because they didn't want to get hung up. Or maybe if there's a gap in between two bushes, they'd throw it in between the bushes. Well, after a while, you learned you had to do better than that. You had to fish tighter. You had to basically be hitting the fish on the head. And here's the other techniques that during this time frame came out that people were using. There's one of the techniques is called gardening. Okay, it had nothing to do with a real garden. People would take long rakes. They would go back in where you had tons and tons of flooded vegetation on top, and they'd take and go through there, rake holes in it. Okay, and then they wouldn't even fish it. At first, they'd go through the whole strip, just raking holes in different places in it, and then they'd turn around and come back and start throwing a frog in it or pitching a worm in those holes and stuff like that. So they were essentially trying to get to where most people are not throwing the bass are not being, harassed by lures all day. There was another technique called wire lining. Now that one really was more about how to get crankbaits and stuff super, super deep back when we didn't have a lot of really deep crankbaits. You had to put a wire line ahead of it and throw the crankbait out there and let it sink down and so they could fish deeper than anybody was fishing. Again, they were trying to get away from the fishing pressure. There's another technique which they called crashing. And this was one of the more interesting one I saw first happen in Percy Priest. Not Percy Priest, but Santee Cooper in South Carolina, where there was a lot of flooded willow bushes one year. And there was one angler that I think he almost won the tournament, but he didn't. I can't think of his name, but he'd take a big, heavy spinnerbait. And even though you had the flooded willow tree and people fishing the edges, he would take it and throw it through the top of the tree down through the limbs and crash the water and just bust around the water. And he would do it over and over. Just, But then this same deal, what he did, when I finally found out later, the guy that was doing this, crashing willow trees with a big spinnerbait, the day before the tournament started, he went through all his favorite willow trees and cut off limbs. Okay, now, nowadays you can get in trouble for changing the habitat through the different conservation agencies, so I'm not promoting that unless you know the rules. But he'd actually cut holes and paths that he could make a spinnerbait, that you couldn't have done it in practice. And it wasn't against any rules at that time. There are certain states now you can't alter habitat. So I don't know, you just have to know what those are. But then another technique was called slip corking. This was done mostly in rivers and stuff where you had current, but you'd have, after floods, you'd have log jams and stuff. Okay, they put an actual cork above their worm, and it'd slip. I mean, you reel it up and it goes all the way down to the bait. Up here about 10 feet, they have a stopper that when you throw it out there and the weight pulls it down, that cork will go up. You're underwater here and the cork will be on top here, and your bait's down there at 5 to 10 feet, okay? Well, why they did this, they'd get above those log jams because they couldn't get the bait under them, and they'd throw right up in front of them on the up current side, and then they'd hold the cork there and then let the worm suck back up under the logs. But the cork's out here. And so it's just, again, a kind of a neat, innovative way to do that. And then another way of crashing and fishing thick stuff like that was called, and I think this has something, is there a biblical carrier named Judah? Okay. Update me on that. Okay. But anyway, they would make a lure, and they called it Judah's plugs. These lures had no hooks on them. Okay. And they would throw in the thick cover and thick weeds and stuff with this bait, and it wouldn't hang up because it had no hooks on it. And then until it generated a strike. And then they would figure out, okay, how can I get back in there to where that fish is? They would find fish with these, what they called the Judah's plugs, had no hooks on them. And then they would go back once they found them. This way they could search for the fish without being hung up the whole time. And then when they found where some were sitting in the bushes or the weeds and the thick stuff, then they'd figure out how to go back in there to them. So it was really kind of clever. I never heard of that technique. There's another technique called kissing. And it was more like what we call, skipping nowadays, where you skip under cypress tree limbs, under boat docks and stuff like that, all the way back to the tree itself. And for some reason they called that kissing the tree. But you had to skip it back under there to get it there. And then there was other techniques called calling, where they'd call the bass in. Okay, they would use. They might even like to use, you'd have a long rod, and you'd have a spinnerbait on the end of it, and let's say this was the weed line here. They'd go down the outside of the weed line, just on the outer edges of it. And then they would go turn around and go back and throw and work the outer edge of it. That was they were simply calling. And when I read these, one thing that was in common with a lot of these techniques, the crashing, the calling, the kissing, was when there was shad spawning. And shad up under there, they're making all that noise and stuff. And that's why they said it rarely spooked the fish doing some of these techniques, especially when the shad were in a spawn. And they were making a lot of racket up in the cover as well. This is another real good article in here, and it was about really getting in tune sensory-wise, sound, your sight, your hearing, even your smell, of all the things in there that might indicate to you or give you a hint that there's active fish in that area. And of course, obviously the one that most anglers know pretty well is birds, listening to birds. But also listening for different types of fish splashing. And good anglers really can tell the difference between a carp or versus a predator fish like a bass. You can tell the difference in sound of it, and so this was, and going into wide angle vision, back and forth from focus, where you're focused flipping under a dock, but then you switch back out, you're seeing down both sides of the banks for birds or bait fish moving and jumping. But it's a really a special article when it comes to using your hearing, using your sight, using your smelling bait fish that are being fed on. So it was kind of ahead of its time type article. Even how to read timber, and even if you didn't have a depth finder, you could, if you lived in the country, you knew where the bigger trees grew along the channel, okay? And if you're out in the lake and it's got timber, a lot of small trees here and a lot of small trees here. The bigger trees will be around near the channel because that's where they always had water. They were protected. They didn't get harvested, whatever the reasons. And this is another really fascinating deal. And you're going to have to look at this close. Doug Hannon was a unique creature for a human being. One of my favorites. Didn't take very many showers. Barefoot most of the time. But see that deal? It looks like a giant whopper plopper, but it has no hooks on it. See him here? He's trolling it behind the boat to attract fish out from the weedy areas to that sound, and he's trolling his lure behind that. Amazing, amazing. And he was known for catching big bass, 10-pound bass, but he was always doing something off the wall. But when you really, it wasn't crazy though. He knew what he was doing. He was willing to try something completely different. And that, of course, brings me to what I like about this. I just joined up with the Livingston Lures, and they've been trying to do that with lures now for 6, 7, 8 years, and I don't think people are really paying a lot of attention to the sound systems in your lures, but it has a lot. It's legit. It has a lot of merit, and especially when you're working the lure a certain way. And I will be talking about that in the future, of the proper way to use that kind of sound, which is a natural sound. It's not an artificial or a sound. There's a lot of polluted sound in the water, your drum motor, boats, paddles, things hitting, but these are actually natural sounds that will improve your chances of catching a few more fish during the day. And this frog reminded me of it because their frog has a sound in it. So even when you stop it in a hole, in the lily pads or something, it will be making this frog sound. And anybody who's ever studied the best topwater fishermen in the world know when they catch most of their big ones. My dad showed me that. I watched him catch 3 or 5 pounds one day, and I swear he'd thrown the bait out there, Lucky 13, popped it hard twice, and then sat there and smoked half a frickin' cigarette before he ever moved it. And I watched him catch, while it was sitting dead still, 3 5-pounders in a row. And every one of them hit after he did sit there for, seemed like forever to me. That's January 1981. We're moving on.